This is the Physical Activity Researcher Podcast, a podcast for researchers of sedentary behavior, physical activity, and sports. Join for a relaxed dialogue about research design, practicalities, and, well, anything related to research. Learn from your fellow researchers useful and relevant information that does not fit into formal content and limited space of scientific publications. And here is your host.
Welcome everyone. This is the Meaningful Sport podcast, and I am your host, Noora Ronkainen. Meaningful Sport is a series of discussions on the why and how involvement in sport and physical activity can be an important part of a life worth living. If you are interested in the theme, you might also want to check out meaningfulsport.com. There you can find podcast show notes, read a blog, and access many resources for further explorations of meaningful sport. I'm very excited about today's episode, which continues explorations of the diverse meanings and practices of running that have been previously held in the podcast. We have already an extensive body of literature on running as a serious leisure practice, but there are also other ways of engaging with running. One of these is run-commuting, which we will hear more about today. I'm delighted to have Dr. Simon Cook from Birmingham City University discussing with me his exciting work. Run-commuting is an increasingly popular activity, or at least it was, before the COVID pandemic dramatically changed the daily routines for so many of us. Simon is a human geographer and a runner whose work you should certainly check out at his wonderful website, Geographies. I will add this link to the show notes. So welcome, Simon, and thank you so much for finding the time for our conversation.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here.
Yeah, I read your work just before we got in touch, and I have so many questions. I've also started this practice of run commuting in the past year, and there are certain challenges associated with, just like you have written in your work. But before we head off, I think it would be really wonderful to hear a little bit about your personal background of being a runner and how the meaning of running and the way you practice running has evolved in your life.
Yeah, and I think that's actually really pertinent to how I've gone about researching running, because it definitely inspired sort of me kicking off my running research. And then as my own sort of running life has changed, I think the research has sort of evolved with it, or maybe the research has evolved my running. Who knows which way around it really is. But I sort of say I've been a runner for most of my life, really. In the UK, a lot of sort of youth sport athletics starts with something called sports hall athletics. And I think I got involved in that when I was about 7 or 8, so really quite young. And then with that, you're introduced to all the different sort of disciplines within athletics. But I think as I sort of continued, and especially as I got older and the distances increased, that's sort of where I found the things I really enjoyed. So, I was quite quickly sort of in my early teens became a distance runner, and really enjoyed sort of the cross-country elements in particular. Getting very wet and muddy in a field in winter was definitely the sort of running I enjoyed. And I was competitive. I wasn't that good, I don't think. I was never winning medals. I've never ever thought it would be like a serious endeavour as such, but it's something I really enjoyed doing. And then that continued sort of into university, where I was involved in the sort of university athletics team at Plymouth, and probably where I performed sort of some of my best stuff. So that's where I really got into a bit more half marathon running and doing that sort of distance. And then since university, things sort of petered out a bit, I think, with moving to different cities and, becoming a postgraduate and sort of dealing with those rhythms of everyday life, it became more difficult to keep up the regular habit of running. I then got hit by a car when I was cycling to work a few years ago, which revealed various underlying health conditions, which means I've just not been able to run at all for the past 3 years. But finally, about 2 months ago, I was able to get back to running after sort of all series of surgeries were all finished, and I was sort of given the green light to to do some exercise again. And that's been such an interesting experience because I've got this history of, being semi-competitive and, speeds and times I used to be able to do, but now in a new body where I can't necessarily do that anymore, and finding out, well, what have I really missed about running? So I'm back to it and I'm enjoying it, but I think I'm doing it for very different purposes than I used to, and I'm getting different things out of it than I used to do. And I think that's definitely also been informed by the more I've been researching running and speaking to different people about, why they run and what they really get out of it, and then starting to see that come into my own practice. It's definitely been an interesting journey into, I think, but one I'm enjoying, definitely.
Yeah, so you've really had a massive boundary situation, as the existentialist would say, that there's like whether it's possible for you to run at all. So I've never had such a long break. I've had like stress fractures, and it would be like 2-3 months and you're not running anymore. And even like trying to run again feels very strange, like you've lost the rhythm after a break, like a couple of months. Yeah, coming back to running, maybe just talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's something I'm, once the geographer in me is constantly intrigued by it. So I am doing quite a lot of reflective thinking about it. And similar to you, over the sort of 20 years or so I've been running, I've had short breaks, maybe a few months for an injury, or just I wasn't, doing as much as I should have done. But it was never too tricky to get back, because my base fitness hadn't dropped too much perhaps, and finding those rhythms again wasn't too arduous. But this was almost a totally different experience with that, because my sort of body had forgotten its sort of movements and how it orientates to each other whilst on the run. It sort of was also impacted that as part of the when I was hit by the car, some of my collarbones broke, so they're in slightly different positions to what they used to be, and all this sort of sense of figuring out how my body now moves on the run. I remember my very first run I tried, I had no idea how far I wanted to go or could go, but I was, it felt very awkward, it felt very clumsy, the running, but it also felt really good. It was a sense of sort of movement and pushing my sort of body physically that I hadn't been able to do for a few years. So I was probably going a bit too quick, and I think I managed about a mile and a half on my first run before I was like, I am absolutely shattered. Which, I used to be a distance runner, so that would be barely classed as a warm up for what I used to do. So that was quite surprising, really. But then I always sort of lent into it. I was thinking, well, if this is my new base or my new fitness, then I work with that. So I very quickly stopped being fussed about how quickly I was going or how far, and I was just doing what felt right and what felt good. And with that, and with the increasing fitness but also increasing experience and habit, some of those rhythms became sort of started coming back to me. And my factuation with checking my stats after each run to see speeds, distance, times, cadences, all of that sort of subsided a bit as I just sort of started to feel like it was running again. And I've been able to get back and do, if anything, I've been running slower but further than I used to as well. And that's also been enjoyable because I'm using it to see bits of Birmingham I've never seen before, and sort of using it for that discovery aspect as well, which is an element I've always enjoyed about running, but sort of came secondary to that competitive training element of my runs, whereas now I'm almost seeing, I want to go to this place. Do I think I can get there on a run or whatever? So it's been a weird experience of bodily experiences, but also meaning changes as I've sort of done this journey back to becoming a runner again.
Yeah, I can certainly relate to that discovery element. I love to go for a run when you're in a conference trip, or that's like the old life before the COVID happened. But if you are traveling and for example going for a conference, the best thing to do is go for a run early in the morning and explore the area. And I also very much enjoy that exploration element. Yeah, let's move to your work a little bit. So you already mentioned from your personal story that running became more difficult with all the other time pressures. So was that part of the reason that you started doing some of this run commuting yourself?
So my sort of arrival at run commuting wasn't from that personally, because as with a lot of academic work, I was based at home when I was doing my PhD. So the commute from the bedroom to the desk wasn't really worthy.
Doesn't require running.
Exactly. But it sort of has its links back in my undergraduate research, actually, which was really great. So I did a geography degree at Plymouth, and I became really interested in the mobilities turn in geography and, more widely social sciences, and how we understand movement as really meaningful rather than something that's sort of devoid and meaningless. And at the time, there hadn't really been anything that looked at running within the mobilities turn. And being a runner myself, I was recognising a lot of the sort of ideas that were being discussed within my own practice. So I decided for my undergraduate dissertation to look at running. And I think one of the key aspects for that was that one of the fields in geography that had generally looked at movement was transport. And that always had this notion of a line between A and B is generally motivated by either what's pushing you from A or drawing you to B. But knowing my own running practices, there wasn't this A and B. Do you know what I mean? It was most commonly people run these sort of loop shapes where they start and end at the same place. So that sort of sense of a locational displacement, the need to get to somewhere, motivating your movement, just didn't seem to be apparent in running. So I thought this was a really useful sort of challenge to these notions and could, really invite other ideas to truly understand this form of movement. But that was my undergraduate, and I then started looking at run commuting for my master's and then into my PhD, which coincided to when I moved to London. So all my postgraduate work was at Royal Holloway, University of London, and there I just started seeing a lot more run commuters. I'd come across a couple before then, but not thought too much about it. But then I became really intrigued in that as a practice for challenging my own reasons to researching running, because suddenly you do have this A to B notion. You do have the need to get to somewhere as motivating the run. So I'm like, well, how do they combine this sort of transport element, the need to get somewhere, with those other aspects of running? So basically, what's motivating that commute to be done by running? And it's been a really, really fascinating element to research. And then sort of about 2 or 3 years into the PhD, I got this job at Birmingham City University. So I had the chance to do my own run commuting, which was really interesting because I'd been immersing myself for a couple of years within this and hearing all the people really advocate for it and say all the wonderful things about it. And I was doing it myself, and it was really hard work. I don't quite know what it was about the commute. The last mile was uphill, which I just don't think is a nice way to start the day necessarily. But I found it so fascinating to be dealing with all the aspects they said they'd overcome, or some of the issues or the experiences that they were finding within my own run commuting. And then thinking about how that related to the work has been really interesting. Since my accident, I've not been able to do it, and now I'm finally in a position where I might be able to run commute again. But we are just working at home, so I'm interested in, whenever I can get back to it, whether my thoughts and feelings and experiences around commuting are going to have changed, sort of another few years down the line, as well as my own running purposes having changed a bit as well. It's a lot less focused on times and speed. So it's sort of my research inspired my run commuting in some ways, rather than the opposite way around.
Yeah. Oh no, that's really interesting. Like, I think it worked both, just like you say, it works both ways, that you already have an interest in this phenomenon, but maybe you learn something that you want to try as well as your research is like evolving. So yeah, let's then talk a little bit about, you were interested in the phenomenon of run commuting. What specifically did you want to explore, and what kind of theoretical and conceptual lenses did you use to do that?
I think, like most people, when I speak to them about run commuting, there's either they've heard of it, but it sounds very peculiar, and it's a bit like, why would you run to work? Or some people have never heard about it, are almost shocked that it's a notion that people think about this and do it. And I think there's that sense of surprise or unknown that really inspired me to try and look at run commuting, because there has been, when I started, it was, it's been going on for decades, but it's definitely been emerging much more quickly over the last few years. And my research was really lucky to come at a time of this sort of when it was coming to more prominence. But there was very, very little known about it. So it had this relative blank canvas of a mobile practice, which was immediately sort of drew me to it in terms of, well, how can we understand this? Because, it's being used for mode of transport. So what does sort of transport theories offer us to help understand it? But then from my own research of looking at it as a form of mobility, has shown that that's a very useful way to understanding it. Then equally, you've got the work of sort of physical cultural studies and sport and exercise, and to be like, all of the different fields might have a really interesting question or approach to understanding what is probably quite a boundary crossing practice anyway. So the research was purposely quite broad to try and sort of start colouring in this canvas of our understanding of run commuting. So I wanted to understand its emergence, its production, and its potential, sort of the three big things. So sort of, why are people doing it, and why is it seemingly increasing in popularity right now? The production is sort of, well, how does it happen? And what are the various aspects that are coming together to help facilitate, enable, or constrain run commuting? And then there's the potential. So, what's going to happen in the future? What role could run commuting play in both sort of the mobility lives of cities, but also people's personal lives and personal biographies? So it was very, very broad. And, the sub-questions I wanted to find out, the list extended and extended. So my sort of theoretical approaches were trying to find, seeking to find resources that could help understand sort of a mobile practice very, very broadly. And there was three in end that I sort of took heavy influence from and sort of merged together. And the first one was Tim Cresswell's Production of Mobilities sort of framework. And here he's saying that any mobile practice has sort of three key elements that are entangled together to produce what we understand by this form of movement. So there's what he calls the brute facts of movement, and we could think about that as physical movements. So, where did they go? How quickly? Who was doing it? Those sorts of questions. There's then the representations of mobility. So what meanings are held and shared about this form of movement, and how do they impact the practice? And then there's the experience of mobility. So how is that form of movement lived? How is it embodied? How is it done? And how do those three aspects entangle together? And that's when I'd been inspired by my first research. That was sort of my comfort ground, I think, and one theoretical approach I found really, really useful for thinking about different elements of a practice and understanding it in this relatively broad way. And it was also inspired by Ollie Jensen's Staging Mobilities framework, which is much more looking at mobilities in situ. So how do they happen in the moment? And he argues there's factors that stage from above. So you've got things like design and regulation, which are impacting how people are moving, which then are in interaction with elements that are staging from below, one of which are embodied performances. So, again, what's it like to do that sort of movement? What experiences are being had? What sort of meanings are being embodied and communicated through that work? And then third one was social interaction. So how do people engage with others on the move? How do they navigate and negotiate each other in these mobile spaces? And then lastly, I was inspired by the Elizabeth Shows and colleagues' dynamics of social practice, because that was a really useful way of trying to understand how these practices come together, but also how they change over time. And again, they have nice three elements to consider in trying to offer sort of a slimline version of practice theory. So one is skills or competencies. So what skills do people have enable them to do this practice? One of them is meanings. So what meanings, representations are held about them. And the final one is materials. So what sort of objects are involved in enabling or the coming together of these practices. So these sort of three guiding influences or sort of frameworks for trying to approach a practice as holistically as possible really sort of guided my theoretical framing of the work and the sorts of questions I asked. And it's not always easy to work across all three, but each of them offered something really interesting to try and understand run commuting, as completely as I thought was possible within a PhD, and have proved really useful for thinking about not only what run commuting is, but the changes that's happened over the sort of 5 years or so I was studying it, and to try and account for those changes.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I mean, you've covered a lot of ground in your PhD. We know that it's always a challenge to limit it to somewhere, but yes. It sounds to me that you wanted to explore a lot of questions in that. But yeah, I think your frameworks that you use, they also give us a nice little structure for exploring your work. So I think we can start a little bit by just looking at who are the people who are doing the run commuting. And after that, we can move to the experiences, meanings, and practices. So yeah, let's just first look at who are the people who are doing that.
Yeah, and it's a really interesting aspect because within who is doing it, there's this sense that the population of run commuters is almost a subsection of the running population. I don't think I've come across anybody who run commutes but didn't run outside of that, or wasn't sort of already doing running and then doing it. So in that sense, you've got quite a narrow population of who are doing it. And running itself, particularly in the UK, is slightly skewed to, it's particularly a white practice, quite middle class as well. So there's already sort of some social divisions within the running population. And then when you get to run commuting, that seems to have been sort of magnified a bit. So, run commuting is about 2/3 male in the UK, predominantly middle class, middle-aged middle class people who work in sort of professional office-based jobs mostly, who essentially are deciding to run commute to try and fit it into their everyday life. So they've basically got a time shortage, are finding it not possible to fit running as much running as they'd like into their everyday life. Therefore they think, where can I find some time to run? And the commute becomes an option. So with that, there become various privileges either at work or at home, which mean that running to work becomes a possibility for them, which is why we see some of these sort of social patterns within it around who is able to, particularly things like job type, who's able to run commute and who is not. That's not to say there aren't others. So, I mean, compared to cycle commuting in the UK, there are a better representation of women in run commuting populations, but they have a very interesting age dynamic, I think, there. You tend to see more women run commuting before average sort of childbearing age, but more men afterwards. So this idea of what impact can children and sort of being a parent have on the possibility to run commute. It would seem that for women it becomes more difficult, so less are able to do it once they've had children and are generally doing it beforehand. But for men, if anything, that is either more of their motivation to do it or whatever in practices which are entwined with commuting enable them that the run there becomes easier or more plausible after having children. So it's there's quite a lot of interesting dynamics going on there within who can run commute and who is run commuting.
Yeah, just like you mentioned also what kind of job you have and what kind of facilities you have at work. Like you probably need to take a shower if you run for like 45 minutes before going to work, and to be able to have some of your stuff at the office or at the workplace as well.
Indeed, those sort of facilities for washing and hygiene become really important, and storage. But equally, there's a sense of it being acceptable to turn up to work sweaty, maybe in lycra, have your smelly trainers in the office. not every workplace or sort of industry can allow that. So if you think about retail, perhaps, you're much more public facing, and whether that's acceptable to have, been running just beforehand, and you imagine there might be fewer facilities to store stuff or change and shower there. So yeah, it's there is quite a lot that goes on, and some of the reasons we see particular, especially in the survey that I did as part of the research, there was teaching and education and sort of banking, finance, and then sort of media as the biggest industries for people who run commute. So whether that represents sort of, seeing somebody run commute can often be the biggest catalyst for somebody else to consider doing it. So this sense of, are they spreading in these industries because more and more people are doing them, but also definitely that there's the facilities or things that enable you to run commute or encourage you to run commute within particular industries which aren't visible everywhere.
Yeah, questions like the dress code in the office and those kind of things. I was doing a bit of run commuting when I was a visiting researcher at the Norwegian School of Sports Science, and when you're in a sports department, then people have skis in their office, and it was quite normal for people to be like walking around, in their, if they were going to the gym, they might be walking around with their like gym clothes and stuff like that, and that was perfectly fine. But I can imagine that in a lot of other offices you won't be running around or walking around with your running shoes.
And that could even change with your role within an organisation as well. So I had a couple of people in the sort of study I interviewed who were sort of the managers or the heads of their organisations, and that was really interesting because they were commenting on the sense of, I use this term atmospheres of acceptability within the PhD to say, to indicate this sort of sense of social relations and what impact they have on whether you feel comfortable in commuting to work. And they were saying that as sort of the managers or the heads of their organisations, if it's okay for them to do it, then they're obviously setting that pattern that it must be okay for other people as well. But they were equally remarking that, they could equally see, perhaps in a slightly different organisation, that they wouldn't feel they could do that. That the example they need to be setting would be more formal dress wear or whatever. So the way that those things can change, even within an organisation where it is, within an industry where it is quite popular, there's a lot of aspects that come together to either enable or challenge it. And it's one thing that sort of the female run commuters in my study were remarking is they do feel more gendered expectations in the workplaces around what's acceptable to look like, and that's why there's fewer of them. Well, they remark fewer of them would probably run commute, and why they're more likely to just run commute home rather than to work, so they don't have to confront with those or live up to those expectations after having run to work. So there's lots of interesting dynamics involved in it.
Yeah, I can certainly see that very easily. Like women need to be thinking about, makeup and hair and whatever, so it's in certain of these practical ways, it's easier for men to do that maybe. Yeah. I read this interesting part of your dissertation where you are writing about running with the bag, and that's something that is different from like runners. When we just go for a run and come back home, we don't need anything with us. But so this having this stuff with you makes it a bit different. So yeah, let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, it's one aspect I was desperate to sort of research, I think, when coming to run commuting, and it definitely was. It's inspired by the role that bags have in run commuting practices, but also partly inspired by how much I hate running with a bag. So I was sort of very intrigued to something which I really despised, how people could tolerate it or put up with it, or possibly even enjoy it. And living in London for most of this research, that you can genuinely see streams of run commuters at rush hour along sort of some major routes, so along the rivers or along the canals or in the parks. It would be endless, and you'd see such a variety of bags, some which are clearly sort of very minimal and trying to keep things light, but some people who are practically on holiday with the amount of stuff they were running with. So I was really intrigued by how they manage this and what the experience is like, but also what it speaks about the practice of run commuting, because the reason a bag is needed so much in run commuting practices, where perhaps not other running practices, is that dual function as a commuting mode. And it's not just bodies that commute, we also have stuff we need with us. So it's quite a symbolic material, really, in terms of how it signifies run commuting. And if most media articles about running to work will feature somebody with a bag as well. So symbolically, it's very important. But I was really intrigued with how people find this experience of running with a bag, perhaps how that's changed or how they've managed it as well. And in the PhD, I wrote this up through a lens of sort of rhythm analysis, which seemed really, really useful for understanding the impact of running with a bag. And I think rhythm becomes quite a natural concept for runners anyway. That it's used in everyday language in running about finding a rhythm, getting into your rhythm. And there's been some great work in recent years by people like Tim Adenza, Jonas Larsson, looking at running through rhythm analysis, and Jonas Larsson's done a brilliant, what's called a fleshy ethnography of this running event in Denmark, which is really trying to pay attention to sort of the bodily rhythms and the sort of biological rhythms that go on when we're running. So this provided really useful material for considering what impact running with a bag has. And there was mostly this sense that it was disruptive, at least initially, to people's running rhythms. The added weight of a bag, the restriction of straps, can really easily change all those various rhythms that come together in this ensemble of a runner. So, your arm swings, your breaths, your leg raises, all these things can change and be put out of kilter, be put, out of what we might call eurythmia, by the addition of a bag and coping with it. And then the bag also takes on its own rhythms as it's sort of attached to you. It's bouncing off you and jangling and jagging into you. And people would report, the blisters they'd got, or, even just things like it makes you sweat a lot more. There's so many different elements that running with a bag has. And for me, when I run with a bag, I feel like I'm running very flat. And that's about as much as I can really describe it. And, it's one thing I tried but didn't end up writing up into the PhD was to use things like, the running analytics you can get from GPS and heart rate monitors to see whether my vertical oscillation, which is, your up and down movements, did change when running with the bag. And I can see that it does. And it's so the sense that I was running flat was genuine. It was changing sort of the bounciness of my rhythms and whatnot. And for me, I just hate it. I really dislike running with it. But for people who either really needed or really enjoyed run commuting, actually they found lots of ways in which they could manage these sort of disruptive rhythms of bodies and bags. So things become tolerable. It's not necessarily the same rhythm of their ordinary running, but they can find a rhythm which suits for them with their run commuting. And there's lots of things they can try changing, sort of like the speed at which they run. The slower it was, the sort of less disruptive rhythms were. The design of the bag can become really important. There are, the running bag industry has found a new market in run commuters, definitely, rather than just sort of trail runners or ultra runners it was perhaps usually pitched to. There's now this, specific need for things for running to work, and there's even a couple of bags purposefully designed for run commuters. So those sorts of things which can lock down the bag to the body become really useful. And equally, things like packing the bag, as mundane and boring as that seems, people were developing their own routines or their own skills in how they best pack the bag, both to reduce any impacts on them, so sort of things digging into them or hitting them, but also to protect what's in the bag. If you're running with your nicely ironed shirt, you would like it to stay nice and crease free by the time you arrive at work. So these various competencies people had developed to try and manage these various rhythms and how they either conflict or may be harmonious. So for some people, it's become quite tolerable and they don't really notice it. For other people, it's still a big issue, but one that's sufferable. And for other people, it's is genuinely the reason they don't run commute, or they stopped running commute. They stopped run commuting because they just did not want to run with a bag.
Yeah. You mentioned a little earlier that a lot of these people who are doing the run commuting, that they are quite serious runners, or they are like a subset of the running community at large. So I'm wondering, like with the bag, your running changes a little bit. Like, for example, you might slow down because that's not as enjoyable, or you cannot find a rhythm with the bag. So would these runners be unhappy with, running slower? We know that runners are sometimes a bit obsessed with their reaching a certain pace or certain time and all those things. So would they complain about that element?
I think there definitely would be those who do complain about it, and it's is a limitation of my work so far, is that I've only engaged with people who are run commuting and are still run commuting. So those who have the biggest issues with it are probably not the ones I managed to speak to. Mm-hmm. But it really boils down to what role run commuting had within their training sort of practices. Most of them are serious in that the time demands mean it's very difficult to fit into everyday life, and they're looking for other ways of getting their running in. That's not everybody, especially as you continue to emerge. I think more and more people are just seeing it's potentially a really useful way of getting the running in. But for those who are more serious, there's a sense that a run commute would never be a training session. So by that they mean they're trying to reach particular speeds or goals or sort of repetitions. They often saw it as just base miles or really useful recovery runs. So they're recognizing that both things like running with a bag, but also running in this time space of city centre commute. You're suddenly, there's so many more people you're going to encounter on your run than you may normally encounter on a run, and you're probably running places you wouldn't necessarily choose to run if you were trying to do a particular training session. So most commonly people are going into city centres, which are going to be busier, where outside of a run commute you may choose to try and stick to other areas which are going to be quieter and allow you to do the sorts of running you need. So recognising those various sort of attributes of a run commute and what it requires. A lot of them just used it as, these are just extra miles, there's no pressure on them, sort of either recovery miles or even injury prevention miles. So I'm just going to jog out yesterday's session, or the session I did in the evening or whatever. And then if there were particular days they were doing what they'd see as proper training sessions, there are various logistic routines they can develop where for a day or two it's possible not to have a bag, and they might go to particular places. So I might go to the canal and do a speed session down the canal because there's going to be no road crossings, and all these sorts of things. But these are obviously knowledges they've built up through their habits and practices of run commuting, which can really inform how to maximise sort of the benefits that they see from it. But yeah, I think a lot of them are happier to go slower as well.
Thanks for joining us this week on Physical Activity Researcher Podcast. If you like the show, make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing or following the show on Twitter. This podcast is made possible by listeners like you. Thank you for your support. If you found value in the show, we would really appreciate a rating on Apple Podcasts or whichever app you're using. Or if you would, in a real old school way, simply tell a friend about the show. It would be a great help for us. We have a fantastic lineup of guests for forthcoming episodes, so be sure to tune in. Thank you all for your support and have a great day.